Welcome to the Hunting Beast Podcast, your source for hunting tactics, news, and stories. And now your host, Mario Traficante.
Hello and welcome to the Hunting Beast 2017 season in review. Dan and I wanted to take some time and go over our trials and tribulations of the 2017 hunting season.
Hey everybody, hey, there's Dewey. See him later?
All right, so we'll get into it. Dan, how's it going?
Going good. It's amazing the season we had, and both of us come out of that with no deer. Well, no buck.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it was interesting.
Yeah, I think the 2017 season, like many seasons, we started it with a lot of anticipation. I'd say together, in the off season, we probably scouted more properties and put more boots on the ground in areas that we normally wouldn't have. Which was funny because a lot of those we ended up not even getting to in hunting.
Yeah.
Due to where the course of the season took us.
It's probably interesting for you, but that's like that for me every year. I scout stuff that I plan on going back to and never go back to. Just because you run into something, you get onto a deer, or, you gotta always be shifting if you want to be on big stuff.
Right. So I guess we can start off with the beginning of the season. Early on, what was the focus? We had a few sits in some public areas, but there was a bumper crop of acorns in a lot of the spots.
Yeah, looking at the bumper crop of acorns, my goal was to dive into the public areas early on and go into the marshes and swamps where acorns were isolated and stay away from places where acorns were everywhere. And I got on deer for sure, but early on I was having a hard time getting on real big stuff. And I should have been where I was at, but I just, it's an odds thing, and I didn't get on anything real big real early.
Yeah, I had a couple really good lessons, I think, on the first two sits that we did. It was specific to hunting remote spots that had acorns dropping. One thing I noticed is that it seemed like with all the rain that we had early in the summer, those acorns were starting to drop a little bit early. Some of the areas we went into, by the time the opener was around, you could tell that the deer had been coming to those areas and had browsed on a lot of those acorns already, pretty significantly. But one of the big lessons I learned early on when hunting these spots is a lot of my previous success had come to getting close to that fringe, pushing that transition between the swamp and the island, or the mainland and the swamp, trying to get in that transition and hunt that. And a lot of times early season, if you push that transition, it's too close. So the one sit that we went out on that public area, you had a little oak grove that was tied right into a transition. That was more ash trees with a few tamaracks in there, and it went out to a point. I navigated back into that oak grove, and I could tell that there was quite a bit of browsing and activity in there. But on that night, I pushed a little bit into the tip of where those ash trees were. I didn't see a deer that night, even though there was a lot of sign that there was deer activity in there. Now,
and I'm sure, knowing that bedding area, that there was bucks bedded in there.
Yeah. And, I'm sure there was deer bedded in there because when I got down at dark, I could hear deer getting up in the bedding and moving out of there. So they knew I was there.
But, hold on a second. Here's where most people would look at that wrong. Most guys I talk to would go, the deer are nocturnal. They didn't get up till I was leaving.
Right.
But deer in early September are getting up before closing time. So it's obvious they were getting up late for a different reason.
Right, and that's the point that I want to kind of bring up as a learning point, a learning lesson for different times of the year when you do these type of setups. When you're setting up in proximity to that food source, but you want to try to get close to bedding. That specific little area, you've got the mainland here. Okay, you've got this point that extended out. You've got swamp here. You've got swamp here. The oaks were on elevation right in here. Okay, this was a mixture of, you had grass in here, you had ash, there was some pine. Now, the bedding was sprinkled all throughout this tip in here. So I had to access this. I actually had to come down, drop into the swamp, and then come up through one of the main trail openings in here and loop around. Now when I got into this area of the oaks, this is kind of what we've been talking about with how close you get to these bedding areas. I mean, we're literally only talking from this point out to here is maybe 150 yards. So there was a lot of browse sign that was happening in these oaks in here. And in hindsight, based on how it played out, I probably should have played it, I don't want to say safe, but I probably should have got into these oaks.
I probably would have been right on the edge of the oaks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Here.
Yep.
And set up. And the reason being is that it would allow me to get close enough to that transition and effectively surprise those deer coming into feed, and they would have got to me. They would have been getting up in daylight. It was a protected area, and they would have got to me. But instead, I got a little over-aggressive and thinking, okay, I'm seeing sign, I'm seeing sign, I'm seeing sign. I actually got out, and I set up about right here. And I was able to set up pretty quiet, but in looking at this in hindsight, there were probably deer bedded just off this tip and just in those fringes, because when I got down at dark, I heard deer move out this way, away from me. So, for me...
And in hindsight, now I'm hunting, how far away from you was I?
Now let me zoom in on that so people could see it a little.
Okay. I was probably, I want to say 600-700 yards from you.
Yeah.
And hunting a different point. And I had deer, hour before dark come past. A couple bucks, a couple does.
Yeah.
So you would have seen deer being further back. And the trick of the matter is, what you did wasn't wrong. The goal is to get as close as you can without getting busted. Where you went wrong is you got busted.
Right.
But you're going through terrain that I don't think you could go through without them hearing or knowing you're there.
Right. Right. So it's a good lesson, because if I get into a position or a scenario like this again, I definitely set up further back into these oaks, or as Dan mentioned, right on this transition, instead of accessing that peninsula or that point that's going out into the swamp.
People ask a lot of times, how close can you get? And it varies on setup. And you're looking here, you could get 150 yards from them. But the setup I was in, just down from you,
right,
I was probably 75 yards from the beds where the bucks came out of. I was right on top of them, maybe even 50 yards.
Right.
But that's different. I walked through quiet grass with pine trees blocking my entrance. Not tamaracks that had no needles like you.
Right.
But I had actual thick cedar trees I used for cover, sneaking up there, and I was able to get in there really quiet. You got boots making suction noise in mud. You had obstacles you got to cross, like down trees and stuff in here.
Right.
And that's where I'd have been back here further, and I think the deer would have made it to you.
Yeah. And the other thing to think about too is that when the season goes on, and we'll talk about this, we could talk about this a little bit later, but I want to touch on it now, is that as the season goes on from early September to, let's say, late October or early November, the foliage that's in this whole area is going to completely change.
Mm-hmm.
The swamp grass starts to lay down, the foliage starts to come off these trees, and that bedding, that primary bedding, tends to push back.
Shifts back. Yep.
It shifts back.
And so do you.
Yep. And that's when you, instead of maybe hunting at this spot right here, that's when you start to shift back to get that bedding that's back here.
And that's kind of what I said to you a while back, but you're doing a fall setup.
Correct.
In an early season time frame.
Yeah, for sure.
So you're kicking through deer to get back to where they normally are in the fall.
Yep. Because my mind was programmed,
from the year before.
Yeah, you get in here and, I've got to be as tight as I possibly can. So I think that's one scenario that people can learn from when you're trying to gauge your how close you should get to this bedding. And the reason why, we knew primary bedding was here, I mean, this is an area that Dan had scouted and knows plenty of times before. So that's how we understood where the proximity of this primary bedding was. So it wasn't going in sight unseen, it was understanding how this laid out.
Yep. We actually, a few years back, tracked a buck through there that we had jumped while gun hunting. And Dave took the track up and we circled this area. And the track went right in through here. And Dave actually came up on that buck bedded and shot it in its bed. And I don't think it was as far back as you were sitting. And that was in November.
Right. The one thing is concerning, and I brought this up on, I don't know if we talked about it on another podcast or not, but a lot of these peninsulas like this on this public property are heavily loaded with ash trees.
Yeah.
And all those ash trees are hit with emerald ash borer and they're starting to die.
Yep.
And it's really starting to change how these deer bed.
Right.
And when they bed. And what I mean by that is when they start moving back. We've got other areas that we hunt that are heavy with ash tree, and that emerald ash borer kills the top of the tree first. That in turn takes away the cover, more sunlight gets into these bedding areas, and those bigger mature bucks, they move out of there. They don't want to bed in those areas like they did before.
And for me, it's really been an eye-opener because the ash tree die-off was pretty instantaneous over the last year or two.
Yeah.
And that whole area that we hunt back there has changed dramatically. I mean, when you look at those, the deer and how they bed, I mean, they're using that leaf cover as much as they're using the base of those trees and stuff. They don't want to be in bright sun and stuff.
Right.
And the whole bedding's changed. Where they're sitting's changed. And it's changed my whole outlook at how I look at those spots because the deer aren't where they were.
Right.
And now you got to kind of relearn it and relearn where they went because of that.
Exactly. So this can go right into another first early season hunt that we did. Dan actually posted the videos out on his channel, but it's where we had that encounter with a bigger 10-pointer. And again, you think a guy would learn his lesson after this sit, but this is again that learning curve that sometimes you can't actually learn this stuff until you go out and you put it into practice and you see what happens when you're on stand. So it's almost a similar scenario to this. We'll see if we can move this guy just up a little. So similar scenario as what we were talking about before. You've got a small oak island that sits here with a little bit of a transition, mainland here. Bedding is sprinkled out right in here. Oaks are all in this area. Now we're talking from tip to tip of this thing, it's maybe 50 yards. It's not a very big island, okay? So the key thing about this is proximity then to the bedding. Dan and I put together a plan. Dan was going to hunt probably 300-400 yards from where I was. We knew this might be a hot area due to the oaks that were dropping on this small island. So again, I accessed this island with the wind in my favor. Now, right away I scanned across this thing, and my mind glued to this corner. I went here, set up, and the afternoon went on, and about, what was it, 4 o'clock, 3:45, that mature 10-pointer came on a rope out of bedding and entered right here. And it just so happened I was sitting on that just off side, so the wind was actually coming from the southeast, and it was skirting the edge of this island. So he winded me. He got into a thick patch of buckthorn, really at only about 15 yards, but he winded me before I could get a clear shot at him, and I sat and watched him walk and then travel out of bedding, travel back into bedding. So of course, Dan and I had a conversation after this hunt as well. You had some sightings that night too, I think, even as far as deer. But the first thing that came up was, why'd you sit so close to the edge, you know? Like, and again, I'll zoom this, kind of bring a little bit different picture of this. You're talking a small island early in September where there's you've got a lot of buckthorn. All on this edge is full of buckthorn, really thick. Okay? It opens up where your oaks are right here. And then you've got some more buckthorn along this edge. But there is sittable trees right here. And after examining it further, what I noticed is that I really could have came onto this island, and there was a tree that I could have set up in that was right about here. That would have gave me, like I said, this is only 50 yards. This would have gave me about a 35-yard shot to this open area where the buckthorn is. And there's a couple main trails, specifically the one that buck was coming in on, this one here, that buck would have walked right into that open area if he would have kept on his path. Now,
part of what I see too is now you know that bedding rotates around this whole area here.
Yep.
I think from past experiences you were really leaning over here.
Yeah.
But I had seen good bucks come out from where he came from in the past. And when I look at that, when you're sitting here on that east wind, anything that comes in over here is going to wind you. Where you can get down here and it can come from anywhere, or at least this side.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and it's really, if you look, this island, as small as it does make a crest on the top of it. And that crest is right about here where those oaks are. And this is all really thick. And you've got, there's not too many trees here. It's mainly some poplar trees that are there. But, you know, these deer, there's really these three main trails that these deer came in on. And a lot of that was learned as the season moved on. I started observing this finally in late season when there was snow on the ground. It became more and more apparent how they were traveling on this island and how they were using it, and how that bedding shifted. Early on, when those deer were feeling comfortable, they were coming into this island early to feed. Some of them were even bedding on these fringes right in here. And then as the year went on, foliage dropped, it pushed back, it pushed back, it pushed back.
Yep.
But You get one chance. That buck showed up on that island.
Well, it's not like you get one chance. You get one chance a season.
Yeah.
You go in there next year, and if you're still hunting there, then you've got a new idea of how to approach it.
Right.
The key is that you learn from it.
Right.
In both situations you just talked about, the key is that you learn from it. You hunt areas, and people get so upset when they blow it, when they do something wrong. That shouldn't upset you. It should make you smile. You should think, okay, next time I got you.
Right.
You taught me a lesson here.
And I think another key point with this too is that if you identify areas like this in the off season, throughout the summer, in the early spring, identify them, mark them, come up with your plan, and leave them alone.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason this buck and those other deer were coming to those acorns is because they were in a pattern from the summer, and they were comfortable being in that area, and they didn't smell any human scent.
Yeah, well, even if they're not in a pattern going to there, if they're on some other food pattern, when they go through there, they're not smelling human scent. They're not getting bothered by humans. I mean, you find a good bedding area in the springtime, like this time when you're out scouting, get it set up, get in there, get out of there, don't go back. Because if you go back even during the winter, even during the summer, if there's deer coming through there and constantly running into human scent, they're going to get more and more suspicious of that spot.
Right. So sometimes it does take seasons of doing a setup like this early and learning, and then you put it in your notes to do something different for next season. So all good stuff. This is things that you can definitely apply for the next time we go out into these areas.
Oh yeah.
All right, moving on. 2017. Where do we go after these early season hunts?
My early season hunts weren't too bad. I mean, I got on a lot of deer. I mean, every time I would make a setup, practically, not every time. I think I had 20 sits where no deer came out, but that's out of 68 sits.
Right.
But usually, a buck would get up and come out of the beds right where I expected. It just wasn't a shooter, But that's the public land thing. I mean, there's not a lot of shooters out there. You gotta keep moving, keep getting on them, and not get strung along by the fact that deer are walking past you. If there's not something there to shoot, move on.
Right.
Early season I didn't do very well, but when rut picked up, I think I got on deer pretty good, and I got on deer real good late season. I just didn't connect. That's plain simple truth. I think everybody has their thing with hunting. Some people are great shots, and they sit and they practice all the time, and they can kill a deer out to 50 yards, or at least on paper. And some guys are good at locating properties that have them. My thing is figuring those deer out. I can go into an area and tell you where that deer is, but I've never been good with equipment, with shooting and stuff, and I got to practice a lot just to be halfway decent. And I probably didn't put enough into it this year. I certainly lacked in my shooting.
Yeah. One thing I noticed is this year, Dan and I hunted a lot of, I would say, partner hunts or stage hunts. I mean, we did that some in the past, and maybe more this year than we had. But what I noticed is this whole concept of a first sit, or getting into an area for the first time.
Not only first sit, but what you should see out of this is, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
No.
you're bringing up a good point here, is not only that first sit, but making sure that first sit is the right one.
Right.
Being in the exact right tree. And this one might sting a little bit, but if you notice when I go in there, whether I kill a deer or not, almost every time the target buck that comes out, whether it's a shooter or not, comes right past me, gives me a shot. And I say this all the time, but I don't think people get it. You've seen me, how long it takes me to decide on a tree when we go into these spots blind and stuff, based on the wind and stuff. I'm sitting back, I'm watching where I walk, and I don't think people are doing that. I think they're going in there looking around a little bit and going, okay, here's one that covers all the trails or whatever, and getting up there. And from you hunting beside me and going in and looking at these spots, look at how much you struggle with the deer when they come by you getting them in range or having that shot. And when I'm in there and those deer come through, I'm getting an opportunity. Now this year I was blowing them all, but I was getting the opportunity. They're coming past me. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's not just the first sit, but it's the first sit in the right spot.
Mm-hmm.
And the right spot's where a lot of people are going to struggle, but that first sit is so important.
Yeah, and a lot of that you can again learn it. I'm not saying that people can't learn it, but you're going to gain more from experience in the woods trying to apply these concepts and practices. So one advantage that Dan might have over someone else is he's done this since he was a kid, and he's been testing these theories over and over and over again. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn it. You just have to take each one of these situations as a learning experience. So, to talk about Dan's mid to late season and the way that these setups played out, everyone typically talks about on their setups. Okay, I want to know where the food source is. I want to know where bedding is. I mean, for us, probably bedding is
change these. Here you go.
Yeah.
2 and 1.
Bedding is probably the main thing that comes up almost on every conversation when we're talking about where we're going to hunt. I think the other thing that always comes up undoubtedly is wind. Yeah, late season we would talk about food. I think this whole concept of access, trails, and not only for the hunter and the deer though.
Mm-hmm.
When you go into an area and you're trying to figure out where you're going to set up, and this is part of what Dan touched on. So you map this out on a map. Maybe you got boots on the ground in the spring, you've been there, you've seen the predominant trails that come in off a tip or a point. You have an anticipation of where deer travel is going to be. You got wind to your face or a nice crosswind where it's cutting across you, you feel the wind is at your advantage. Now where do you set up? We're not doing presets where we're going in and putting a tree stand in 2 weeks ahead of time, cutting shooting lanes, and then going back in to hunt it 4 days later. We're walking in there and we're deciding on foot. For me, sometimes the most challenging thing to do is you sit there and you're looking at, all right, if I sit in that tree, I'm going to have this in my way, that in my way, where am I going to get my shot? If I sit in this tree, is the wind going to wrap around and bend here and my scent's going to travel across that trail? Or I've got this trail coming in, this trail coming in, how do I get access across? So part of it is, where's your best cover? Where's your best position you can get to play the wind in your favor? What I've heard you talk about, and you can touch on this, is where do you set up where you can shoot to all or the majority of the trails that are coming into that spot, based on where you feel those deer are going to access your spot that you're in. Another one that comes up is, how are you facing those trails on your setup?
Mm-hmm.
If you're straight in line with those trails and it's coming up a rise, those deer are going to be coming up that rise and they're going to be looking. They're going to be looking up at you as they come up. And we've had this where you get picked off a lot.
Yep.
In those areas we talked about where there's a lot of those ash trees and that foliage up high was dying off, you're sitting in a lot of dead ash trees. Well, there's no cover.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get a 45-degree angle or perpendicular to that set of trails where those deer aren't naturally looking in your direction as they're coming up? That's a huge factor. And being able to plan where you're sitting. Sometimes I think I set up too close to the trail where that deer is going to be right on top of me, and I don't necessarily need to be. I can be just off 15 yards, 20 yards, Because I can make a 20-yard shot to the trail or 25-yard shot to the trail. So I talk about maybe what goes, because those are the things that go through my mind when I get into an area. You know, I'm thinking wind, I'm thinking access trails, I'm thinking once I get up 15 feet and then I get up that other 6 or 7 feet, what are going to be my shooting opportunities?
My big thing is I want to be as close as possible, but not too close. So I'm looking at it from a distance because I want to look and see, okay, if I walk somewhere, am I going to go so far that I can't, there's no coming back and there's no place to set up there.
Right.
Because I do not want that buck to hit my scent trail, my ground scent trail, before he gets to me. I mean, bucks that are in bedding areas, in areas where people don't go, are ultra sensitive. It ain't like they're walking out where people usually are. They feel safe there. They haven't had no people around, that's why they're bedded there.
Right.
So when you go in there, you have to go in with that sensitivity in mind. So I'm standing back a little bit and I'm looking. What's the wind doing? Okay, is there an opening there? And if that wind is hitting that opening from the spot I'm thinking about, is it going to swirl into there? Is it going to pull a certain way based on the terrain? Is there going to be a thermal effect come evening time when those deer get up? When the wind calms? And what is my estimate of what it's going to do? Doesn't mean it's exactly what's going to happen, but you take your best guess based on the terrain. And then I'm going to look at the trees. I'm going to look for one. I'm going to find an area. This is the area I need to be in. And it's going to probably be down to about 10 feet, 10-foot area. So there's 1 or 2 trees. And I'm going to be looking at, okay, where in those trees do I have a spot where I don't have to cut any openings, I'm concealed, and I can shoot. And then, once that's decided, how am I getting there from here? How am I doing it quietly? How am I doing it in the least conspicuous way where if a 100-inch 8-pointer comes out and walks across my trail, is he going to boogie and take somebody with him? So I'm trying to figure out how's the best way to get in there.
Yeah.
And then when I'm walking that last distance, I'm going slow, going hard, and I'm looking. I'm watching. I'm using cover. I'm keeping the trees in between me and potential bedding because sometimes they're right on that edge, watching out. I'm going slow and I'm planning a route because I'm not walking on trails no more. I'm walking to a tree, right? So I'm planning a route. I'm looking at the ground and saying, okay, where can I step? What am I going to run into walking over there that's going to cause noise issues or it's going to cause some sort of issue? And I'm planning a path to the tree. And it sounds like overkill, but it's not.
Right. Yeah, it really, the planning the path to the tree is interesting. Which made me think of one of my sits from the season, and it was in late season. But after that snow was on the ground, it became apparent how deer were traveling some of these areas. And so we've got this little island hump here. Let me zoom that in so you guys can see that a little better. So the interesting part about this island is you've got an access trail here, and it meets up. You've got an access trail here. There's another access trail that comes in here.
What do you mean by access?
These are where bedding is. So this is bedding.
Okay, so access for the deer to get to the
access for the deer. Yeah. And these were heavy and beat down. They were obvious trails that were being used throughout the whole year. They were just really apparent now that there was no cover. Now, there was a row of bigger trees, a couple ash that were patterned through here. This was full of buckthorn all around. Which even in the late season is hard to walk through because it's making noise and everything is really noisy. So there were a few large poplar that are along this edge. Now again, my anticipation was that the main bedding was going to be here and here. And that's where I was focusing on deer coming from.
So what do you got for wind?
The night that I hunted this, the wind was northeast. I had a northeast wind.
Okay.
So
what's the scale of this drawing?
from here to here, you're talking like 60 to 70 yards. It's not a big island.
Okay.
And again, because it's in late season, a lot of this foliage is down. Your wind is coming from the northeast. Now, why this was interesting about where you set up. I wanted to be able to shoot out to this transition out here. The thick bedding is out into this cover here. All right. I chose to set up close to this trail, but I chose to set up right here. I could actually shoot out to the edge of this bedding.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in doing that, when I came in, how you're talking about choosing your path,
Mm-hmm.
I actually walked the natural path into this set. All right. Now, what was interesting about it, I had deer come in from every single direction except myself. Okay? So, I had deer enter from the west, the north, and from the northeast, and then I had them traverse this lip. Now, in hindsight, except for these deer that moved this outer rim out here, every other deer that I encountered at some point or another was on this cluster of trails right here, where they all intersected. Either if they were coming from the west or if they were coming out of bedding onto the island, they all sort of met right at this apex point. And why that was problematic for me, because the spot that I set up in, I was a little bit silhouetted, and the deer were coming, accessing from behind me. Now granted, I could see them, I could shoot to this point here, I could turn and shoot back to them, and I could shoot anything coming up here. But those deer, at some point, would get right on top of me. And they were very, very nervous. A couple of them silhouetted me. A smaller buck and another deer that was behind it, I couldn't really turn around enough to see it, came from my west. The smaller buck walked right underneath me and continued out onto the swamp. The other animal that was with him, which I didn't see exactly what it was, didn't like it, turned and walked off. And he actually smelled my trail. They right where I walked, every single deer put its nose down and smelled that trail. Now the younger deer, they just walked right through. I had a fawn, I had a three-pointer, they all walked right past me. Anything that was a little bit older, they stuck their nose down right in that spot where I crossed the trail, and they froze. Which I guess doesn't surprise me. So then I guess the question is, in a scenario like this, where would I have set up differently given the time of year, so on and so forth? I might have been better off setting up in one of these trees back. Now that we're talking maybe a 25, 30 yard difference here, but I would have been back off from the deer. I wouldn't have walked on that crossing trail.
And you'd have kept the wind in your favor completely.
I would have kept the wind in my favor. Now, could I have shot this transition out here? No. But
based on the trails and stuff too, I would have liked to have come in wind right to the nose, because when you got deer coming from every direction, then you've only got one scent trail.
Right.
You come right into the wind and...
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, an access was the other thing, yeah. So, I mean, I actually saw that when I was on stand after the first set of deer came from my west, effectively following the trail that I took in. It was like if I would have been back off this way, they wouldn't have expected me there. I could have watched every single one of those deer walk by unalarmed.
You brought up an interesting point too. You said how every deer smelled your trail. I had very few deer smell my trail this year, even where I walked. And you're gonna get guys that are gonna see that. But what you see is, like, certain areas, they're all either bothered by your scent, or all of them aren't.
Right.
I don't know why that is, but it's true. But you're gonna get guys that are gonna go out there and they're gonna say, "Why do I need to follow this program? I go to that tree. Deer walks across my scent trail. He doesn't smell him. He gets downwind of me. He doesn't smell him." Well, I can tell you right now that 90% of them, 99% of them aren't showing no reaction to me.
Right.
But I'm still taking those precautions, because if you're under the belief they don't smell you, you're wrong. They're just not showing reaction. And it's going to affect whether they come back again. It's going to affect how mature deer act.
Right.
And it is going to make an impact on your hunt. So don't get under the belief that they're not smelling you just because they're not reacting. I mean, I've had deer this year where I drop milkweed, watch it go down and land on the deer, and that is your wind current. Don't tell me, "Oh yeah, well his wind current's going over the deer." No, it's not. It's going right to that deer. That deer smells me. He's just not reacting because he doesn't know I'm a danger.
Right.
True. But to get to that point, I mean, that axis is really, really important, whether you see a reaction or not.
And the other thing with the reaction in a scenario like this again is the deer that were coming out early and crossed my path. Now, there was a few nice doe in that set of deer, but those were the early exiters from bedding. And a lot of these deer, because it was late season, they were moving from bedding to a primary food source that was off to the north. But how they reacted and how they choose not to stage in this area and they scatter and find other ways is going to impact the way those mature animals come out of bedding and access those areas. Because we've seen this before. When you get a group of, the 1.5-year-olds, the fawns, a few mature doe, if they come into an area and they stage and they feel comfortable and they're moving around and they're browsing, those mature bucks, it's almost as if they wait in the congregation of other deer. If they see deer in an area, it makes them feel more comfortable, and they'll then, beyond their patterns, when they get up from bedding, closer to nightfall, they will access an area when there's other deer there. So by these deer busting up and scattering and getting spooked, even though it wasn't, it's having impact.
Yeah. So let's bring up something here once. I bet you a lot of people watching this are going, how come I go out hunting and I hunt 20 times in a season and I see 3 deer and these guys are getting on stuff?
Yeah.
What are they doing different? And part of that first sit thing is, can I wipe this out? Okay. Part of that first sit thing is, let's just take, here's a property, okay? Let's say this is 400 acres, right?
Here's this darker marker.
Okay. Let's say this is 400 acres, and it's all swamp terrain, mixed up islands, points, all that crap, right? And you're like, okay, I want to look at a map and I want to know where to go. Well, I could probably take this swamp and point out 50, 60 spots, right where they might be. And when we go in there, why are we getting on deer and they're not? Well, we're not all the time. But what are we doing differently? Well, this spot looks really good, and we're going to start out coming in from this direction, right? So I'm going to hunt here, Mario's going to hunt here. And we're going to cover this little section. Hey, nothing happened. Okay, that section's gone.
Right.
Where are we going next? Well, let's go up here. I'm going to hunt down here, Mario's going to hunt here. Nothing's going on. Where are we going next? We go up here, I'm hunting here, Mario's hunting here. I saw a big buck over here. Okay, next time we're tackling this and this. Okay, now we've seen a bunch of deer. We're tackling here and here. What are we doing? We're moving across this property rapidly, covering everything, and getting on those deer.
Right.
So you're taking your little sections, cording this off, okay, and hunt it down. Don't sit here because there's a little sign and a couple rubs and stuff. You're either seeing deer or you're not.
Right.
Move across this property and hunt it down. That's part of that whole first sit thing, is that it keeps you moving. You know, you get into these different areas. There might be an area up here you never hunt because there's not good terrain or whatever. You never hunt there? Ding, 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 ding. Overlooked.
Yeah.
I mean, look at that spot where I had that opportunity at the big 8-pointer. I don't think anybody has hunted that area on that conservancy land for 5-6 years maybe.
Yeah.
Nobody. Because there's no trees or nothing to sit there.
Right.
And what did I do? I said, well, there's got to be deer going through there. If nobody's going through there, I got in there, and the first time in, I had an opportunity at that real big 8-pointer.
Yeah.
In that first sit.
Yeah, and I think this is a good point about access and about how you spread yourself out across property.
And you think about it. I mean, we had our opportunities on that property you were just talking about in key areas. But is that where we started? Is that what we were first looking at? I mean, if we're honest, we looked at it a little bit. But we were really like, well, what about this point over here? What about this? What about that? And if we're honest about it, there was a lot of dead sits or sits where, well, medium-sized deer or does or...
Right.
We had to narrow it down.
Yeah, it takes a while to learn a property to do this, but I think, and I don't, again, I don't want to take away from someone's preference of how they want to hunt, per se, but I know this system works with how it puts pressure on pieces of land and how it deals with pressure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether you're hunting on a private piece of property or a public piece of property, if you break it down into sections and you strategically hunt those sections, hunt an area, cross it off your list, move on to the next. Hunt an area, cross it off your list, move it on to the next. The thing you have to be mobile. You got to have the equipment that allows you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it also gets you into an area where it's quote unquote a virgin sit. Now, I mean, what I found with a lot of the combo hunts that Dan and I had, we had our most success when either one of us were going into a spot, and by an area, this might be a section of 20 acres or 10 acres, where neither one of us had walked or sat before, or if we're on a public piece, I mean, we were not aware that someone else had been in there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was no human sign that someone else had set up in there.
Mm-hmm.
And on public, you're not always going to know that. Some of it depends on where you're accessing and whether or not you think anyone else knows about that spot. But the second and third times we sat in these areas in the same
Mm-hmm.
time frame of the season,
No, those deer figured you out.
those deer figured us out. I mean, after one sit,
Oh yeah.
the mature deer figured you out.
And what's funny about that is you could have a trail camera in an area soaking. You check that trail camera, and the same buck is coming through there day after day after day after day.
Right.
You hunt it once. He doesn't come past you, and you didn't spook any deer, and watch that trail camera go dead.
Yeah.
And that's what people don't get, is they don't always show reaction. You don't always see that physically with your eyes, but they know you're there.
Right. Determine your path going in, and if you're hunting the same physical area, if it is a 400-acre area on a piece of public, or is your 70-acre private spot, determine your predominant access point and always take that access point in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll have your little branches that you need to get off into your spots where you want to sit, but the predominant way that you go in and out of there, stick to it, because the deer year over year over year are going to begin to tolerate your scent and your access on that spot.
Some of my best repeated hunts, when I did hunt a spot over and over again, were spots where I set up right on the walking trail right up a tree because they tolerate my scent there.
Right. Right. it's something you got to think about. So that's a good point to make. I mean, our season is sort of littered with this format of, I think the first 4 sits we did, it was you, me, and Jeff, and it kind of followed this pattern. We were hitting those spots on public, but we were all in different areas. Okay, now that's checked off our list. Well, what'd you see? I had this come through. Okay, that's checked off our list.
Right.
And again, hunting for specific wins and on specific locations, but if the mature animal isn't coming out of that bedding area, then he must be set up in this bedding area over here. If he isn't in that bedding area, then he must be in this bedding area, and you keep moving until you locate that buck.
So now we hunted this bedding area, we hunted this bedding area, we hunted this bedding area, we didn't see nothing, right? So now the deer comes wandering in here and goes, somebody's been in there. So that puts them even more in the areas you haven't been in yet.
Right.
You kind of narrow them down.
Yeah. Yeah, don't underestimate the ability of that too. Like as you go into these different spots and different bedding areas, you're stacking them. Yes, you're intentionally / unintentionally putting pressure on them, which is going to move them into those other areas that they feel are more secure.
Yeah, this area here might be like, let's just say that this area here is like solid dogwood with little humps in it that deer can bed in really well. And there ain't a tree in there. There's 8 million paths going every direction. There's good rubs coming in and out of there, and there's paths coming out all over the place, but nothing consistent. Man, I'd probably take my axis right through there on purpose. Kick them out of there or put them up here where you can hunt them.
Right.
You gotta, if you take a property like this and you don't hunt every section of it, you're giving that deer a spot to just have a free ride. You don't want deer to have free rides.
Yeah.
You want to kill them, right? So if he's living here and you never hunt that area, and he's never getting out of this section, in daylight, why would he ever leave? I mean, he could feed way over here,
Right.
and still live here, in daylight. If you never give that a shot, you'll never kill that deer. That's why sanctuaries don't work. You'll have huge bucks, you'll get them on camera, but rarely will you kill them because they'll just live in that sanctuary forever.
Right. Yeah. So, other things about the 2017 season. Sitting in weather fronts, and what I mean by weather fronts, there was a lot of rain sits this year.
You know what I like about those rain sits? I was sitting in the warm house.
Well, I was sitting in the rain sits. I probably sat, I think I'd have to look at my journal, at least 10 weather fronts.
Yep. We were out there a lot in the rain, yeah.
And it just happened to be, sometimes your schedule and what you have planned, that's what I had to hunt. So I had to go hunt it.
Mm-hmm.
One thing it did affirm to me, I didn't connect on any of those hunts, but I did see deer.
Mm-hmm.
I had deer. I experienced the pre-movement 30 minutes before the front comes in.
Mm-hmm.
When that wind is shifting and that barometric pressure is changing, I had deer up early.
Mm-hmm.
One of the sits, I had a hard wind in my face. I had just gotten set up at about 2:30. At 3 o'clock, I had 2 doe and a smaller buck coming out of bedding, and this was earlier. I think that was early October. Moving out of bedding in high winds about 25 minutes before a storm front was rolling in,
Mm-hmm.
and they were cruising right through out of bedding, moving to food. I also had the opposite effect where I sat a morning where there was a storm front moving in, rain for the majority of the morning, and I got to the point where I was cold, wet, and tired, so I was deciding to get down. Of course, right when I do that, I'm packing up my stand. I'm actually in this little transition between the swamp and an island, and I look up and there's 2 bucks that at about 9 o'clock, 9:30, they moved on to this island. Now they weren't the ones, a buck that I was particularly after, but one of them walked broadside to me about 12 yards while I sat on my knees. So that was pretty cool. It was a cool hunt. But again, they moved right after that storm front went through and that rain stopped. They got up and moved.
Right before and right after.
Yep.
And that's not to say you don't see them move in the rain, but usually what I see is right before and right after. I hunted a couple of rainstorms, not many though. I had a lot of action during rut. Rut was insane this year. I mean, I saw a lot of deer. I had one big buck come by at right about 35, 40 yards at the end of my range, and I broke my own rule. And that was that big dark buck. I think you've seen him too.
Yeah.
I never really got a good look at his antlers, but he was obviously a shooter. I had him at 35 or 40 yards, and he stopped broadside, quartering away, and was like munching on something. And I broke my own rule. And that rule is you take the first good shot you have. But I was coming back from being a kicked puppy. I had just had a couple opportunities just a couple days before that I blew. Actually 3. I hit a limb on one and missed the deer. I had one I just plain missed. And I had one that caught me drawing. And I was thinking, okay, the way this land lays, that thing's going to roll right down this trail and come by me at 25. Just let it be. You know what did that thing do? He went straight out into the swamp, and there ain't even a trail, and just wandered off. But I could have shot him. You know, that bothers me more than the ones you take a shot at and don't get, because you had the shot and you didn't take it. I don't know why that bothers me so much, but it does. It gets under my skin. Not to say that it bothers me, because really I'm just happy to get an experience. But what I'm saying is you feel like you should have took that shot. You should have took that chance. You should have went for it. But I had that happen. I had one that came in on me from an unexpected direction. He came up a transition line through a whole woods to me. A transition where buckthorn met open woods. And he comes down the trail, and it takes the one trail, the same one I walked. Doesn't smell my scent or anything, but walks right up the same trail that I walked on, and comes right to the base of my tree. And the only way to go is right past me here, quartering away. So I pull the bow back, and I'm waiting for him to turn, and that thing snaps his head up and somehow spots me straight up in that tree, and does this, shocked look number, and I thought, at this range right here, I got a good shot right over his shoulder blades, right into the vitals. I'm going to take it. And it was probably the wrong thought, but you're at full draw, you're aiming at him, and I shoot, and I don't know what happens, but the deer looks up at me kind of crazy and runs off trotting, and then he just starts walking again, and he works a scrape about 50 yards from me, and I'm like, what the heck happened? And I'm looking, and I see my arrow in the ground way over there. And I'm like, what happened? I get home and I go over the video footage, and when you're watching, there's a limb right in front of my arrow, a little branch, and because my sight picture, your sights are 6 inches above your arrow, so I'm not even seeing that. And in the video, you can't. It's plain as day. You can't miss it. When I squeeze that trigger and that arrow goes off, you see that little limb just cut off, and it's going through the air like that. I don't know how I didn't see that with my eyes, but I had that one. I had the big 8-pointer. We already put the video up of that I missed. Right. And I had the one on that point that came out, and I was just about to draw, and he spotted me in the tree. I seen a lot of bucks that were just out of range, like going through the swamp and stuff, and I had that one real big buck that we were after. I mean, that thing might have grossed Boone and Crockett.
Yeah, we can talk about that one a little bit.
Okay.
But I think, one of the things to mention, a lot of these spots, we typically, as the phases of the season go on, we can circle back and stage and hunt some of these other areas. Now, we've said this before, the more spots you scout, the more places you have to hunt, the more options you have, you can move around without over-pressuring an area. The mature 8-pointer, that spotlighted you on that tip. You and I have hunted that spot a number of times. That was one buck, first sit, sighting. The 8-pointer on the apple tree that you had
Yep.
opportunity on. First sit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we actually did go back into that area. I think one other time. You went back once. I went back once. Real low deer traffic. I don't think either one of us saw a deer back there, and it kind of taught us a lesson about how sensitive that spot was.
Yep.
And next year, we're going to approach it differently. We're not going to.
The key next year is to beat Mario in.
Yeah, some of this is like how we can beat each other back to these spots because we know how sensitive they are.
Right.
Early season 10-pointer. I know either one of us, if we get access to that island again, we're going to hunt it a certain way, and we learned some intel there. First sit, see a mature animal. And we can go sort of on and on. To the next sit, there was a little transition peninsula that connected two mainlands between a swamp. This is a spot where we typically use as an access trail.
Right, the human trail goes right through the middle of it.
Human trail goes right through the middle of it. And
you know what, let me just say something right here once. This spot always has good buck sign. There's always good rubs there. There's always good scrapes there. There's always big tracks there. And I always looked at it with a blind eye. I said, there's two swamps there, it's connecting. Yeah, I'm sure they run across here or whatever. But all this human scent, they can't be coming through here at daylight. They can't be doing this. And I really didn't give it enough credit. I think you sat there one time, and I think I kind of urged you to do it too. Let's just see what's going on there. And you had all these bucks come by, but they're all immature.
right.
And then that even made me more blow it off. Yeah, it's a playground. So go ahead.
Yeah, and we had sat the other connecting areas to this, and what I mean by that, in this swamp, typically you'll get some poplar groves that'll grow on the points, and we had sat these points because there's some good bedding out in the middle of the swamp, which we never walk into these areas. We've heard other people say that, well, why don't you just cut through there or hunt into those spots, and it's like, that's kind of, when we're doing something like this, where we're pattern hunting an area, going into those swamp bedding areas where you've got your dogwood,
End up here,
your tamaracks,
and go in like this,
yeah,
so that you don't molest this.
right. That's our last resort, is to physically walk into those swamps, into those bedding areas, and set up in what little tree cover there is. Only because you get one shot once you walk in there. But I had a sit where I sat on the edge of those poplars. You had a mature buck get up from bedding. You knew it was a mature buck because it was breaking branches and stuff on its way out. It was making a rub. It moved out, and that kind of led to, well, if we would have been sitting on the opposite side of the swamp, I think that led to me doing a couple of my rainy day sits on the opposite side of the swamp. We never got eyes on this mature animal. I sat another time off that poplar point, and again, we're talking like a point like this, and you've got a swamp out here. Primary bedding was located here. We were making our sits here. I had a buck, just like clockwork, get up like we thought, and he wrapped around in front of me and followed this swamp out. But he was a smaller 8-pointer. But he was at 30-yard range. And it was good to see like this plan pay off. So all the while we decided that, okay, let's finally throw a camera up over in this spot.
I think if you remember, there was a cherry tree that was rubbed at a rub on about this big around, about that high up, and there's a big scrape by it. So it kind of led a little more to putting a camera over it.
And it was actually the trail that we normally take in. We walk in. A scrape appeared. That was like 25 yards from it. So we first threw this camera back off of the scrape, like, I don't know, it was a good distance away, because at first we were getting really distant pictures. It was probably like about 30 yards away from that scrape was, because we didn't want to get our scent right on top of that. So we got a couple pictures of this, what I would call giant ghost buck. Two things that it did. I think that buck led us on, both you and I, throughout the entire year, which is a little thing to say, something to say about trail cameras and what they can do, because they provide good intel, but sometimes they block what you normally would go and do, which is, I think we would have moved throughout the property and staged hunt a lot more.
Well, I think actually that could. I agree with you on how the trail camera kind of led us on.
Yeah.
But I think it could have worked out better. I think the problem was the first sit was made with expecting that deer was doing something other than it was doing,
Right.
based on what we saw on the camera.
Right.
Now, I went in that area, and we knew that we were getting that big buck on that camera. And you had shifted that camera in, as you were preluding to,
Yeah.
to right over the scrape. And I went past that camera and went to another area where I'm thinking, well, this is probably where this buck is going through. And I went and I sat there, and it was a morning.
Yep.
And I don't know, what time was it, like 8 o'clock in the morning or so? I get a text from Mario, and he says, "Are you on, Stan?" I says, "Yeah." He goes, "You where you said you were going?" I go, "Yeah." He says, "That buck just walked by the camera, and it's heading right for you," because it's a cell cam, so it's emailing the pictures. So I'm like, okay, this thing is coming right at me, and the wind's in my favor. And I mean, how far was he from me? Like 300 yards? And I can see half of it, 150 yards. I can almost see to where he's talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there waiting for this buck, and he never shows. So I'm like, well, what happened? So we knew he was walking. I'm here. He's walking this way, and he never shows up. So what would be the most logical next hunt, the first time we go in by that camera? Well, heck, this is kind of thick over in here, so I'm going to sit right here, and when he walks past that camera like he did last time, there's a good rub line going right through here. The scrape's right here, and his rub line goes like this, right? So I'm figuring he's walking right through here. I don't know how he didn't get past me here. Maybe he went this way, maybe he turned this way, but I'm going to sit right here, okay? So mark that spot. So now we've seen that buck. This is the first sit in this spot. Second sit here, right? The second sit for this buck now. Now, we've seen that buck on camera. I think it was almost 3 days in a row. I think it was 3 out of 4 days or something like that.
Yeah, and these are, most of the picks were night picks, but the one that you just mentioned was a daylight.
Right.
Right.
So now I'm moving in.
Right.
And I'm going to sit right here, and when he walks past that camera, the camera is just about out of range. But when he clears, I got a good tree here where I won't get winded and such. So I sit here, and here comes that buck. Right down here, right through here, comes around, walks in front of the camera, turns, and goes this way. So we were thinking he's traveling this way, but that's because of where he got caught on the camera. He was really going like that. So then, I moved right here. And
Yeah, it's, I guess by scale it would kind of be like right.
yeah, okay. And when I got in here, you could see the huge rubs going down his trail down here that we never even knew about. Just giant rubs. And that was it. I mean, then then it was game on. When he did show up, it was in darkness. He knew something was up. This was our chance. This hunt should have been right over the top of the camera, or this spot would have been a dead deer for sure.
Yeah.
But if I would have just went to right over the camera, it would have been dead. But the fact that when that deer went around that camera, he wrapped around, we just assumed he was going this way. He
And
wasn't.
we had caught that buck moving in both directions.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of hard to read what his travel patterns were, why he was.
I think a lot of it was there's a bunch of does hanging in here.
Yeah.
And I think that the doe trail was what those markings were. That wasn't really a buck trail.
Yeah.
It was a doe trail that was marked by bucks because of the doe scent on it.
Yeah.
The bucks were going like this. They weren't walking through this open timber. They were getting from this thick swamp to this thick swamp, at least this particular buck was. And he wanted to take the path of least resistance. And when I looked at it, I felt like an idiot because I know better. When you look at the terrain, what's the first thing you see about the open area here? Where's the thickest spot in the open? This connection right here where that trail is. So he was just taking the thickest area through here, through the open woods, to stay in swamp.
Right. And even the cam pic, the daylight pic that we got of him, where he walked in relationship to the camera, it was obscured with foliage from buckthorn because there was a heavy amount of buckthorn that was all in this area, especially right through here and all over the tip. And when we looked at this from a map, again, we never really paid attention to this area over here. We noticed that there was a little hump that came off this point. And again, Dan went in and he did his third setup right here. And once you got up in that tree, all of a sudden you see big rub right off this point. You could see the faint trail that he was taking through here, and you could see the scrapes that were worked.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, 1, 2, he's onto us. 3, he's probably really onto us, and we don't get any other sightings of him on stand. And we hunted that area more than just that one time.
What blows my mind is we've been through that whole area, and I thought we had seen every deer. And then that deer shows up, and he showed up on that camera. I don't know how many times, but we got other cameras out there.
Right.
And we never seen him anywhere else. The only thing we really know for sure is he walks from here to here.
Right.
After that, I've got no freaking clue. I think he's hanging up here, either feeding or bedding, and then he's either feeding and bedding down here. But this is his travel route because we had pictures of him going this way and that way, both in morning and evening.
Right.
It was bizarre. This hunt was kind of interesting because remember we were thinking he was going like this.
Right.
I don't know if you remember me talking about that, but I was thinking I know he's not going straight through here because I would have saw him from this stand. So he's either staying in this swamp or he's cutting across. If he cut across here, I'd probably even see him from this stand. So I was thinking he's going down here, which he kind of was, but I was thinking he was, skirting along this big point that was over here, and I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I hear this running, and the doe that's been hanging here on camera that he's always with comes running out looking back, and you can hear grunting, and all of a sudden his buck comes running out chasing her, and I'm getting ready, and he comes around, and he actually ran in a circle around my tree and stopped right here, and it turned out to just be a little 8-pointer, but that was that was exciting.
Yeah. And that was the same day that you had eyes on him actually on.
Yep.
That was the one
Yep.
time we had eyes on him in stand.
Right.
You had eyes on him on stand. And it was obvious. I remember, I think you told me, he goes, yeah, after that 8 came by, when he came by, he was clearly a more mature animal. There was no mistake.
Not only that, but he grew since he'd been on that camera. Man, I was mistaken by what I was looking at on that camera. When I seen that thing firsthand, that thing was if it was a 10-pointer, it was Boone and Crockett, but it was a 9.
Yeah.
It was Gross and Boone and Crockett. It was a big animal.
So, hopefully...
And I thought I had him. I mean, you see that thing coming down here like this, and he's curving around here, you're like, he's going to walk right through here. This is a done deal. It's a dunk shot.
The lesson that can be learned from this. There are spots on every single property, whether it's public or private, that you're accessing, where there is overlooked areas that you're not giving consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because you've always just assumed, well, yeah, I see sign here, but I always walk through here, so I'm writing it off. Or, I've never seen a mature animal here. Now, one could say that if we never put a camera there, and if cameras weren't around, we'd never even know about this buck, and that's true.
And part of it, too, is that whole hitting it right on that first set.
Right.
What got me on this set is that wind was a southerly wind. I believe he smelled me when he was down here. Now, there was no reaction of it. There was no sign of it. but it was certainly game on after that, and we walk through here all the time.
Right.
Because this stand here is actually on the walking trail.
Yeah.
It's walk up the tree from the walking trail. But yet when we hunted that was it. That was our chance. And you got a lot of these people think that you can stage your way in, move in close, move in closer, move in closer. You get that one chance. Once you're close, you're too close. You got to either go for the kill or sit way back and watch.
Right.
There's no in between.
He didn't get that big from making mistakes.
Right.
And but the good thing to know is that, that mature animal, he'll likely, and again, that deer could have been shot, we don't know.
I think next year pre-rut, I'm going to hunt right there and send Mario over here.
Yeah. The one thing that's interesting, though, when you find out about a little spot like this that's sort of an overlooked spot, and we had seen other mature rubs, and I'm just talking your regular rubs, other mature rubs that would give us an indication that a mature animal was moving through the area, but you kind of are like, well, it opened up other options to where I might set up. On the other side of this transition, you start looking at trees and thinking to yourself, well, now that I know this point is here and I know these access trails are coming in off the swamp, I picked out a few trees that are along this southerly edge where I could shoot to that point. Same concept, I don't have to get in here, and if the wind's right, I can come at it from the other side.
Sure.
And even when you get up high on that edge, to be able to see down into that swamp and catch eyesight of them. Because a buck like that, you're going to see its rack moving through the swamp. So that was a cool, this whole thing was a neat cat and mouse game. Even though, it was something, this ghost buck we had seen mainly on camera, but Dan had eyes on him once on stand. I mean, I laughably will say I was hunting about 400 yards north of this spot in the morning. It was about, 4 o'clock, 3:45. As I was putting up my stand and getting all set up, that buck walked in front of the camera. And it's just funny because I was only about, at that point, 400 yards from where he was accessing. But he was then moving in the opposite direction of what we had normally seen him move for a return back to bedding.
I did do a hunt earlier in the season that really was only a few hundred yards further up here on a little island on the tip of it, and there was some really heavy rubs coming through there. And a buck came under me just after dark where I let it go because I couldn't shoot. That had a really big cage on it, but it smelled where I'd walked. I was sniffing around under the tree, and it walked straight this way, like towards this area, and it might very well have been that buck.
Yeah.
But it was just too dark to shoot or to really get a clear image of the rack. You just see something gray above its head.
Right.
But that one came right through here, and that might have been this exact same buck. So I think we were probably on him more than you even know.
Right. But it was interesting because it made us think about some other fringe early season bedding areas that were this mature animal could have been bedding. Because we started mapping out his proposed travel patterns across the area we were hunting.
Be interesting to see if he's on the same pattern next year.
Yeah.
We'd be going after it a little different.
And this is the other thing that I noted earlier that was something we wanted to talk about, which was changes, how these bedding areas change as the season goes on. Typically early season you got a ton of greenery, you've got a lot of cover, there's a lot of water in these swamps, the deer are more comfortable because they're not pressured.
It's not noisy, crunchy leaves.
Right. And because of that, I would say we see a lot of, call this any transition. This is mainland, and this is swamp. We see bedding on the transition right here. We see bedding here, and we see bedding out in these areas from the mature animals. But early in the season, and I've seen this just from bumping deer, I see way more bedding taking place
On the edge.
on the edge. And why that's important is that when you're going in to hunt these spots, recognize the fact that you're going to bump deer if you encroach these too
Well, you know, when
close.
when I had that chance at that buck where he caught me drawing,
Yeah.
it was a point kind of like this one. And this is all wet swamp that drops off. And there's a little island here is where I thought they were bedding. And what I had done is go on stand on the back, and I scouted my way in.
Right.
And when I got in here, there's a big scrape, a huge rub that was still bleeding.
Right.
I'm like, that deer's in here. He's in here right now. So I crept up and I set up. I can guarantee you I would have heard that deer walking in the swamp. I didn't hear him until he was walking in front of me, and I figured he was a squirrel because I never heard a swamp until I saw his legs moving at 10 yards.
Right.
That thing was bedded right on that tip. And I got in that tree. Man, I don't think that's 40 yards from that tip. And that's probably further than what it was. But he was bedded on that tip and got up. And I think that thing did probably hear or know something because he was acting a little funny. Come out, look around a little bit. So I think, the wind was obviously in my favor. But I think he had a little inkling that I was there. But that's the whole key of getting in there. You might think he's out here, get in that stand quiet because you never know what's around you.
Right. And that's where, so you got this September bedding. And I'm not saying the mature stuff isn't going to be bedding out here in September, because it is. But that comfort level, it's a combination of cover and pressure. So as you start hunting an area, you're putting pressure on, it's going to push them back. As the season starts progressing, you're going to see the leaves are going to start falling. Now that buckthorn will hold leaves for quite a long time. That swamp grass is going to start laying down. Okay? Trees that are out in the swamp, they're going to start losing cover. And that more secure bedding is going to typically start moving back and back and back. Or those little overlooked areas during the season, or the areas where it's thick buckthorn cover that no one walks into. They're going to migrate to those spots.
It might even shift back over here if it gets late enough in season, like when the swamp freezes.
Right, and that's, go ahead.
Yeah, so they'll shift back over here. And when he gets, what Mario was talking about before, I want to touch on a little bit, because I slightly disagree. When he says there's deer bedded here, here, and here, and sometimes they're mature, I don't think these deer are mature. It doesn't mean they're not shooters, but the 2 and 3 year olds I'm not calling mature. I think if you got a pressured area and it's 4 or 5 year old deer, I never see them bedding there much until winter. When it's frozen, sometimes you see them come out of the swamps and bed on the tips. But the real big mature stuff is usually back here. The trouble is getting through this stuff. But the bucks that bed there aren't necessarily not shooters. Like I just said, I had that one bedded right on the tip. It was a shooter, but I'm saying it wasn't mature.
Right.
So I just wanted to get that point across.
Yeah.
I think when a deer gets to be 5, 6, they are bedding out here if at all possible. They start learning that they want to be surrounded by water if possible. Any place you got that swamp land, water is a huge security. Shallow water where they got cover in the water, thick grass, brush and stuff. Coyotes don't go through the water. People don't go through the water. They have no problems out here. If they have a problem, they hear you coming for a mile.
Yeah.
Big bucks love it out here. And sometimes that smaller stuff just ain't allowed back there. You've seen how aggressive some of these bucks can be.
Yeah. And so this kind of brings us to our other point. So you got pressure, you got change of season, foliage is dropping, it's putting deer further back where there's still foliage, they can get out of the sunlight, okay, and they can still be in that thick cover. The other factor, you have now, as we're seeing, as invasive species and disease. So these ash trees that are dying off, it's completely changing how these islands
Yep, sure is.
are being used for cover, because ash trees would typically carry their leaves into late into the fall. I mean, I had one out in the front of my house, and that thing would be dropping leaves and retaining leaves sometimes into that first or second week of November before they would all fall off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as they become diseased, their emerald ash borer has been kind of decimating them. A lot of those are dropping leaves. They don't even grow leaves on the top half of the tree at all.
And a lot of the stuff like in the swamp by me, they're all dead already.
They're all dead. So all these areas that typically might be a point like this, that was completely covered with ash trees that provided blockage from the heat of the sun and provided thick cover and protection, those deer are vacating the areas. And they're going out into these swamp areas where they've got more cover, where they're going to getting into those thick areas of dogwood. Okay? The other thing that we've seen on the high ground, a lot of the saplings and smaller trees that would grow up amongst your oaks, okay, and your other things in here, your maples, the forest floor is being covered with buckthorn.
Yep.
So we've seen huge sections that are so thick with buckthorn, you can't walk through it. I mean, you can, but if you try to walk through it on a hunt, you're going to make a ton of noise. You can't shoot through it. There's barely any mature trees to climb up to get down to shoot through it. And what we're seeing is, yeah, early season doe and smaller bucks are bedding in that, but you get into late season, what we observed during the late season, those are primary spots where they're moving out of the frozen swamp and they're moving onto that high ground bedding in proximity to a food source in that buckthorn.
Yeah.
Because it's thick, it's
It's
dense.
acting like dogwood.
Yeah. There's corridors that run through that stuff. And
Another thing about that buckthorn, did you notice as much feeding on that as I did in early season?
Yep.
Man, I had them walking through prime food plots on private land to get to patches of buckthorn without eating in the food plot.
yeah.
I was amazed, but it really opened my eyes this year at how much deer prefer that buckthorn leaves.
Yep.
It was amazing to me.
I watched them browse on the leaves and on the woody buds. In late season, I watched deer walk and come through. And when they were herding up to go from bedding to food sources, I watched them walk through these, what I just call them buckthorn corridors. Because when the snow is on the ground, you can actually see these deer traveling through these corridors. And these deer were feeding on those woody stems and branches of those buckthorns all throughout the late season. Saw it on multiple sits on the late season.
Yeah. You're going to see some huge changes in the next few years because that buckthorn has taken over this country. All of our elm trees are dying. All of our ash trees are dying. The whole landscape's changing. The way they bed's changing. And you're going to have to adapt with it.
Right. It really makes it harder to hunt because it's more difficult. It's more difficult in these big timber areas to get in and hunt them because all the big timber, the transitions between the big timber is just loaded with a wall of buckthorn. And the deer find ways through it. They cut corridors, and we know from experience that these mature animals were utilizing it. I mean, I found a spot where eventually when we weren't hunting that area anymore, I snuck back there, and it was literally a triangle like this that was surrounded by buckthorn all around it. And this triangle was it was an open area in here. And inside here there were 3 huge scrapes. There were rubs, and there were these access trails through the buckthorns. Like this was like a centralized staging area, and it was all protected and surrounded by buckthorn.
I know where that area is.
And it's it's interesting because these spots are hard to hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And I see more of this change happening.
Mm-hmm. I saw a lot of rut cruising on those transitions where, I don't know if you know how buckthorn grows, but it grows as a mass, almost like a cancer through the woods.
Right.
It's like there'll be a whole area that has no buckthorn, and you just have this wall of it that every year it moves 10 yards.
Right.
And it just keeps moving. And the edge of that buckthorn, man, was that a travel route during rut. And you wouldn't really expect that, but it was.
Yeah, we've often said that these mature animals, like that big one that we talked about, they like to walk those transitions.
Yeah, the edge. Mm-hmm.
Because, if an animal has a larger rack on it, it's not going to tangle through. Just like we don't like walking through that stuff and having branches snag on your stand and your face. And deer are the same way. I mean, they'll follow that thick, but they're going to walk through where the least path of resistance is. So we were seeing them travel this buckthorn transition. So you got open timber here.
Mm-hmm.
You've got thick buckthorn here. And these deer were following this buckthorn transition. Now there was trails, wide open trails that the deer through use have cut through that buckthorn that they can go in and navigate their way in and out of. But during the rut were those scrapes. You'd see a scrape open up here, see a scrape open up here, you'd see a scrape open up here.
Yeah. What else I saw too is you see a lot of deer sign in that thick buckthorn. But in a lot of cases, what I would see when I'm hunting or actually observing would be different. The big bucks would walk the edges or those few open trails, and everything that would come out of those areas with all the deer sign had little racks.
Yeah.
A big buck couldn't even get his rack through that stuff.
Right. It wouldn't, it wouldn't want to. The doe love it because just like the dogwood cover, if they're being harassed by a bigger buck.
And we saw that with the rut chasing. Those does would go straight into the thick dogwood, or straight in the swamp, or straight into the buckthorn.
Yeah.
One or the other, and lose the bucks because they couldn't run through the crap and chase them.
Right. So it's great cover for those smaller bucks or those doe. Those littler bucks will chase
That
the
might
doe
be
in
part
there.
of that too. That whole surrounding the buckthorn, because the does are hiding in there that are going into heat because they're hiding on the bucks. That might be all of. Because most of the time when you see them following them thick transitions, it's with the wind blowing through the transition. Like in this case, it was a south wind blowing right through that transition, and they're actually smelling the thick and watching the open. Same way they bet on it. They'll bet on the edges of that too, looking out and smelling the thick.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think, if you've got a private piece of property that's a little bit overrun with buckthorn and you got different transitions, maybe it's hardwoods that are starting to get some buckthorn growing up in it, or you've got swamp transitions that these points are just getting covered with it, it's very difficult to control. I mean, we've tried.
Now it's starting to take over Dave's property.
Right, we cut it, we treat it with chemicals, it grows back up through the through the roots that you cut it with. But I think you can. It's because it's a factor that's out there now. I think you can manipulate it. If you've got private property, you can choose which sections you want in there. I mean, in the off season, you could even cut trails through there. And I can tell you that those deer, from what I observed in the late season, they're going to use those open trails that are in that buckthorn. Those mature animals are going to use those open trails because they're still going to want to go across the topography a certain way, but they're not going to walk through thick, dense buckthorn that's, a half inch in between each plant where it's hard for you and I to walk through it. They're not going to do that. So you can manipulate it a little. If you got it on your property,
it's going to be just like dogwood. You're going to have to hunt the edges, hunt the openings,
So keep that in mind. As seasons change, your foliage is going to change. It's going to shift bedding around. We had a drought at the end of the summer. It completely impacted all the tall swamp grass in a few of the areas that we hunted. It laid it down. And none of those bedding areas really developed normally as they would. Because it seemed like the deer just vacated those areas where that swamp grass was laying down and they didn't have the cover. And then you compound that with ash tree problems and it shifts where the deer move. You got to hunt them in different spots.
Yeah.
All right, so far we've talked about really a broad overview of our 2017 season, but we covered the importance of that first sit. We've talked about kind of the good, the bad of using trail cameras, stand placement, and how important it is to have your stand placed, and if you're going in mobile, how you go about doing that. Sort of the final thing that the season took Dan and I to is a lot more late season hunting. We've been fortunate enough to be tagged out early on, either in the first week of the season or that late October time period. This season, you and I were both on stand the
right
last
till the bitter
day,
end. Right till the bitter end. Yeah.
And we did a lot of cold weather hunts, cold sits. So let's talk about late season patterns. What did you see?
I saw what I expected. The deer were isolated. There was certain areas that had all the deer. I got onto some good buck activity and the best hunting of the year, really. I mean, even though I had that good rut and stuff, man, was I on the deer at the end of the season. I was hunting 4 of them by the Conservancy and that were really good. And it was funny because it was in a spot where you probably heard me whine a little bit like, oh, I got a bad draw, I got this bad spot. And it turned out to be, I bet you were envying me a little bit. But that, and I had it, because we got the plots in at Dave's place, I had good buck activity by Dave's place. A lot of the deer we were after by Dave's got killed. There's a lot of heavy pressure around his farm. But there was one that made it. One that I was seeing late season, and that was a pretty good 11 pointer, but 10 frame. And there was that one, and he was, coming into the plots on a pretty consistent basis. And when we get bitter cold, they're moving in daylight. So what I was doing is watching where they're going and waiting for those bitter cold days in the right wind direction. And when I had that, I'd go in for the move. And the trouble with late season is those days are so short. There's no time to scout because you got to work.
Yep.
It'd be nice to be one of those guys that hunts for a living and be able to take the whole day off and scout and hunt and stuff. But you got to get on those deer. You got to find them, locate them, get on them, and hunt them. And you only got so much time. And it's funny because if you got a week in rut or early season, you think you got all the time in the world. But you feel pressured at the end of the season, don't you? When there's only a week left.
Yeah.
But I really had a plan for that last Friday. That was my kill day. And the biggest buck I was after wasn't coming through on a regular basis, but he was showing up occasionally in daylight. But the second biggest one was on a real consistent pattern, and that was that big 10. And I think that thing was pushing near 160.
Yeah.
And he was coming through on a pretty consistent pattern, but everything was feeding in that area. And I would have about 30 deer around me. And I knew that. So I was kind of looking for that right wind. And I set up right on the hiking trail. For that reason specifically. I mean, most people would have said, I ain't hunting here. It's, open grass and stuff. I'm diving into the dogwood. Well, you'd have blown it.
Right.
I got in there, got up that tree, and I had deer crossing my scent trail and such. And I had deer get downwind of me. I never had really much of any problem. I had a couple deer notice me. I had one buck, a spike buck, that saw me in the tree, walked over, smelled my steps, kept looking at me, walk over, walk around a little bit, come back a little while later, look at me, and he didn't see me as a threat. But anyways, I had all these deer around me that day, and it started getting later and later, and it got to almost closing time, and I thought, he's not coming. This is it. And I had about 110-inch buck in front of me off to the side a little bit, moving around in some dogwood, and I still wasn't taking that end of the season or not. But it got right down to the end, and I heard something behind me kind of clicking. And there was a little chasing going on, even that late in the season.
Yeah.
There was a couple doe fawns getting chased around by bucks. and I looked behind me. I had to move real slow because there isn't a leaf on a tree.
Right, right.
I mean, you stick out like a sore thumb. That's why deer were noticing me. I did stick myself in against a cedar tree. I picked an oak tree that still had leaves on it. You know, oaks hold real late.
Yeah.
And got stuck in there where I had a little cover. But you still stick out like a sore thumb. There's no leaves on those trees.
Right.
So I hear some clicking, so I look real slow and I move my head and my eyes and I look behind me and I see 2 deer on the other side of the cedar tree. And they're only 15 yards from me. And they got their heads together and they're going at it, but it's getting late. It's real close to closing time. But I can tell right away that their body size is bigger than most of the deer around me. But I'm thinking, they're sparring, they're probably not big bucks. And the one kind of breaks free and chases the other one a little bit and then starts walking underneath me. When he goes underneath me, I can see it's that big 10. And he's walking right directly underneath the stand. Straight out here, he gets to about 10 yards. And he stops quartering away, puts his head down, and starts feeding on something. And I go, and I'm going to pull that bow back, but there's a lot of deer around. So I raise it up slow, and I practice this. I aim it at the deer, and I pull back real slow like this. And I get it back, and that's the whole trick, is can you get this bow drawn? And especially from a sitting position. I don't normally shoot sitting, but I certainly ain't standing up with all those deer around me. So I get it back, and I get it on him, and I'm putting that pin on him, and I can just see something moving around, and I make out a little leaf, and in that gray light I wasn't seeing it all the way, but I could tell there was something in my line of vision. You know, it was just right at about closing time, and you start losing vision of those little tiny twigs and stuff, and I can tell there's something there. And I know it's clear a couple steps up. And I made a key mistake. I should have just held at full draw, waited for him to pick his head up and move down the trail. And that would have been one dead deer. I ain't missing at 7 yards, you know. So I'm kind of half thinking, should I blast through this limb? Then I'm thinking it might be bigger than I think. And what's going through my head is that shot from early season hitting that limb, and that arrow ended up 10 feet from where I was aiming. No, I know what I'll do. I'll try and just rise up. All I got to move up is 12 inches and I can shoot over this limb. And he's not looking my way. And I did this number here with that bow at full draw. And as soon as I moved, something over here spooked, and the whole place went in a stampede. And I was just starting to shoot, and the arrow went off. And luckily I didn't hit the deer. I hit the dirt when he took off, but the whole thing was blown. I just looked around and I started laughing. I was out there, I mean, because what you're not getting out of this is, man, it was like 8 below or something.
Yeah.
I had icicles hanging on my face, snot sickles.
Right.
I was so freaking cold. And you know what? I like that deer. I was kind of half rooting for him. But it was and you look at that and how it unfolded. And I took one more hunt and I went after the one by Dave's, and he didn't show up, but the last day of the season, I had 4 bucks come under me right before closing. I could have took any one of them, and I decided to just end the season with nothing. And I wouldn't change one thing in that season. The only thing I would change is the deer I wounded. That one bothered me a little bit. The one I shot at Dave's out of the preset stand, that one bothered me a bit. But the rest of it, I wouldn't change one thing. I am perfectly happy going through the season and coming out without a deer. It wasn't a hard season. It was a great season. It was a blast. I hunted hard from the beginning to the end, and I'm not really in it for the kills anymore. I'm in it for the hunt. The hunting is the part that I love. It's the chase. It's the thrill. And I got to do that all season long. I was already thinking in early season, man, this is going to end soon. What am I going to do? Maybe I can go to North Dakota. Maybe I can go out to, I've never been in Nebraska. Maybe I'll try hunting in Nebraska. That's the stuff that was going through my head. And it's kind of funny how you get a little ahead of yourself. You start feeling a little cocky, like, yeah, I'm going to kill one pretty quick here. And as soon as you start making plans and stuff, somebody slaps you back down the sides and says, oh yeah? We'll see if you even get a deer.
Right.
But for me, it was a great season. And I'm okay with not getting a deer. As long as it don't happen next year.
Yeah, I think when that month of December hit, I was out of town for work in November. A funny thing about that, I think Dan and I mentioned earlier in the year, I said, yeah, I got to go out of town was it late November for work for a week. He's like, well, isn't that going to be funny if you haven't knocked one down yet and you got to go fly out of town? And I honestly, I thought to myself the same thing. Well, we've had such good fortune in early season.
You know, I always think, just not to interrupt you too much, but just one thing. What I was thinking is Mario's going out of town. I'm hunting all the spots.
Yeah. So you start thinking that, like, oh, it's going to be, I'll have this wrapped up and locked down. But I would parallel a lot with what Dan said. It forced you to get out and test, why you do it. Is it for just the kill, or is it for the challenge of getting after these bugs? I had the same thing in December. As the deer started to herd up and they started focusing in concentrated areas where they were traveling from bedding to a food source, I saw more deer on the sits that I had in December than I had the entire rest of the season.
There's clearly the best time of the season.
Right. It showed me how these deer were moving through areas that I would hunt in the early or mid-season, but the foliage was up, and there were spots in that cover where I knew they were probably traveling a certain way, but I wasn't for sure. And now, once the snow was on, and I could track, and I could see them on stand, how they were moving, it opened my eyes to some other, again, overlooked spots that I'm going to look to hunt in the early and mid-season next year. I had the first sit that I had in December, I saw 11 deer, and again, about your first sit. I hadn't been back into this area in a while. Sit, 11 or 12 deer I saw. I had a buck grunting and chasing doe in that first week of December, which, I know people a lot of talk about the late rut and what activity is going on. It was cool to see. Multiple doe I had come underneath me. I think I saw the same 5-pointer and 4-pointer a dozen different times throughout December. I had probably 110-inch 8-pointer come underneath me.
Tell me this too, you get the most consistent patterns. You see the same deer over and over again. You don't see that as much early season. Right.
And as I started to move around, there's some of the properties I hunt, there's adjacent farm fields, adjacent cornfields that are cut corn. Some still had scraps. I noticed that deer that were sometimes a half mile away, they were all moving in a pattern to get towards where those crop fields were, going from bedding to a food source. Now, it didn't work out. I had a couple nice bucks, a really nice 8, and another 10 that were on camera. Of course, you'd catch a camera pick in daylight during this time, and then I'd try to sneak in there and get set up on them, but I never saw them on stand. I never saw the mature bucks on stand. But my last sit, it was another great hunt.
Yep.
I got into the transition between the mainland and the island, and this time I kind of knew that these deer were moving in a general direction from bedding to food. So they were actually moving from the mainland to the swamp, through the swamp to another area that had food, crop fields in it. I had 8 doe underneath me and 2 smaller bucks. And I sat and watched a smaller buck and a doe at 30 yards until it was too dark to make out anything anymore on the last night, because I was waiting for that more mature animal. And I just made the choice like Dan did, so I didn't get anything. But it was fun pushing myself to be out during that time of the year. There were some cold sits where I thought to myself, I got up in this little ash tree, I remember one sit, and I went to grab a branch, and everything was so cold it gets really brittle, that this branch snapped. I thought the whole tree was just going to snap and fall over. But you're out there, and it gives you intel and insight into how those deer pattern differently. Definitely I saw deer vacate the primary bedding spots and the secondary bedding spots in the swamp. Once that swamp froze, they did not like walking on that frozen ice.
I watched the shift. Yep. Where I was, they're in the dogwood and coming up onto a little high point and then going back in and coming up, and then all of a sudden the shift, you're expecting to hunt them on a certain wind, All of a sudden they're coming from behind you because they came out of that swamp when it froze solid and went up on the hillside in the pines.
Yeah. There was one morning when it was, I don't know, it was with the wind chill, it was about 15 below, so I decided to do, we just had a fresh snowfall, so I wanted to get out there and just walk the area to get eyes on tracks going into bedding, and just lay out a plan of how I was going to hunt this place for the next few days. And that, I had a little 4-pointer. Just in the middle of the morning, he crossed past me, but I was able to walk this whole section and really take a look at how the deer were utilizing the bedding. And that swamp bedding that was holding water in the mid and early season was vacated. You know, a couple reasons. Everything was laid down in there with the snow, and the trails that were in there that were holding water had ice. And the hoof prints that I did see in there, they were slipping on there. And if you look at it from the standpoint of a deer versus a predator, the coyotes can run over the top of that stuff, and there's a pretty healthy population of coyotes in a few of these areas we hunt. And the deer are just vacating those spots. But what I did see is those groves of buckthorn and those areas on the high ground where they had protection from the wind, or they were in close proximity to other food sources. They would bed in those areas. I found lots of beds that were inside of those buckthorn groves. You know, sumac will hold leaves and berries. Those deer will feed on sumac later, and there's a couple specific spots that had in the areas that we hunt that had sumac in it. And I found that those deer were bedding closer to that because it was a food source. But the open timber, if you didn't have food, you just didn't see deer in the late season by those.
Yeah, it could be a desert.
It was
it's
like
feast or famine. You're either in the deer or you're not.
And that's another thing to think about too in the late season. It's like if you locate a herd, or you start seeing those deer herding up on a pattern, even if you're seeing smaller immature deer, the likelihood of you catching a mature deer coming into that herd or coming into that congregation, it's a good time to shoot a mature buck.
That's not necessarily the case in early season.
Correct. The bucks are worn down from the rut. They need to replenish, you know, for those harsh times during the winter and get their strength back up. So they are slaves to their gut.
It's probably not the best time to shoot a buck, but it's the best time to shoot a mature buck.
Right.
The bucks that I was seeing in daylight late season were extremely nocturnal earlier. I mean, you could get them to move, but it wasn't far.
Yeah.
And you had to be set up perfectly and close enough. But in the late season, you could get them to come a distance. They were moving around in daylight. As soon as you get that bitter cold weather, they're out there. It's really a much underrated time to hunt.
Right.
It is probably the best time to pattern a big buck. You can sit back and watch them go into a brassica plot, or watch them go into dogwood, or watch them go into some feeding food source, and be relatively confident they're going to do it again day after day. Yeah. In early season, I do the same thing, but it might be more like 1 out of 4 times they show up the next day. It's pretty much they show up day after day in late season. It's just a matter of waiting for the right conditions. That cold weather might be getting them out a little earlier. But late season is the best time to shoot a mature buck when it's 5-6 years old.
And like anything, you know, hunting weather fronts, like hunting in rain, you got to get your game plan set up of how you're going to do that.
Not just 1 pair of blue jeans, 2 pairs of blue jeans, and 3 t-shirts and a sweatshirt.
Yeah, you need to buy Dan some clothes so he's not frozen the next time he tries drawing on a 10-pointer. That is part of it. Some of these sits, it was sub-zero temperatures. And then in order to get in the right spot, you had the compounding effect of the wind, and it was cold.
You know, part of my thing is I acclimate to the weather.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think a lot of people get that, but you get used to cold weather.
Oh yeah.
If you're somebody from like just for instance, like when we go down to Florida and it's 50 degrees out, you're like, this is great. You got a t-shirt on, right? Look around. Everybody's wearing winter coats.
Yeah.
Why? They're cold.
Yeah.
We're not cold. We're like, this is nice. Because we're acclimated to the weather. So when I'm out doing yard chores and stuff, I actually go out in my t-shirt and do my work with no coat on or nothing in 0 degree weather, because it acclimates me to the weather, because I don't want to freeze when I go out there and hunt.
Yeah.
And that's why I can take that weather dressed like I am.
Yeah. It's cold. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I used a variety of different things. The things that, what really helped me, I think I bought stock in those little hand warmers, but my hands and my feet get cold during those sits. There's just no doubt about it. That's the way I am. But I know that about myself. So, I carried one of those little pouches where I can get my hands in there with the hand warmers. I had a fleece jacket that I'd wrap around my boots. Rubber boots get cold, Rubber neoprene boots that are insulated or claim they're insulated. When it's -10 out, they get cold.
What I learned was my feet used to always get cold, and it's because I would try bundling up with more and more socks, and I'd take all the air out of there. Now I put one pair of socks on, a heavy pair, and my feet are warm.
Yeah, you got to have airflow in there.
Yeah.
Even the last day, because I did almost that whole day sit on that last day, I just took a fleece coat, wrapped it around my boots, and I dropped like 4 of those hand warmers down inside that coat, and it heated it up, and my feet stayed warm all day. I sat for like 6 hours that day.
Literally, you're a beast. You were sitting out there all day in the cold. Like, I went out there for the prime times.
Yeah. Well, it was the last day, but I ended up seeing a lot of deer that day. I think late season, the big things I got out of it though were the herding of the deer, the patterning, the shift from bedding from those swamp bedding areas to the high ground, and I saw mature bucks move on those weather patterns. If you can get in just ahead or just after a snowfall and get into an area, you're going to see movement. That bitter cold is going to get them to move early, but it becomes. I mean, there was many nights where it was getting dark quick, and I was saying to myself, man, if I only had that extra hour when it was daylight savings time to,
Right, or a lot of times it's right at closing time.
Yeah, they're moving right at close when it's getting dark.
Yeah. But every now and then you get surprised. You get a trail cam picture of one at 3 in the afternoon or something. You're like,
yeah,
of a good one.
I had one exciting hunt where this was, it was over Christmas break. It was during that stretch because I had taken some days off of work, but I'm sitting. I get a small half-rack 3-pointer come by, 2 doe come by, then I get some doe moving out of bedding in the swamp, and they're moving in front of me, and I'm sitting up in this poplar tree, and I think every deer looked up and was silhouetting me, but they'd kind of tolerated me. They looked, and then they'd move on. I had ones walk right underneath me. So it's getting closer to that good kill time right before it's getting dark. All of a sudden I hear a lot of commotion happening out in the swamp, and it's cold, frozen, and dry out there, but I'm hearing all of a sudden I look out and I see this tree just waving back and forth. It's just getting hammered by this deer, and I'm like, all right, here we go, finally, here it goes. I get all ready, charging right onto the island like he's a boss, is this little 5-pointer, and he got onto the island, and he turned, and he shot west. Now, the reason why that's important is because during that time of the year, I was seeing a number of scrapes open up, like real aggressive rut-type activity was going on. And it was all in these areas that these deer were congregating. They were herding up around the food sources, getting up out of bedding, herding up, and then moving towards where those crop fields were. Well, this little 5-pointer, I don't know if there was a doe that was in late estrus or whatever, but he was going around and he was making these scrapes. He was the one making the scrapes. When I walked out that night, I followed that trail that he went out on the high ground. And not only did he hit the scrape that had been opened up previously, but he made a new one. And so it showed me, those late patterns. It would have been nice if there was another mature buck in the area that didn't want to tolerate that, and would have came out and played and dealt with him, then I would have got a shot at him. But that was cool to see. You know.
Yeah. I think the big question that's going to come up now from people watching this is we're talking about how great late season can be and how we got on all these deer and the patterns and stuff, and there's probably a bunch of people, that guy right there, see him? He's going to say, you know what? I couldn't even find a track. What is this teaching me? I can't even get on a deer. So how are we getting on those deer? And the key is going to be covering a lot of ground. You're going to have to take some time and scout.
Yeah.
And hopefully you got snow, because if you got snow, it's a piece of cake. You
Right.
can drive around to public properties and look at the tracks going in and out, and where there's more tracks, then start looking in a little closer. If the roadside within a quarter mile where you want to hunt ain't got a track on it, you're probably not in the right area. Keep going until you got some tracks, and then backtrack them back, find out where they're going, find out where they're coming from, and keep looking around. Look for those areas that are really thick, and it's not going to be an annual thing. Sometimes you got them, sometimes you don't. There's some areas that'll have really good deer hunting or buck hunting late season every year, and there's some areas that because of a food source or because of something happens will have real heavy one year and then not the next. And you just got to get out there and really cover some ground, and that's what it takes. I mean, if you're going to think you can do this on your 80-acre section that you always hunt, it might be a ghost town late season. Good luck.
Right.
And the reason me and Mario are getting on big bucks in late season is because we're going to where those bucks are. You can't just count on your old areas. You have to go find them.
Right. That's a good point. I mean, if you don't have snow on the ground, then it really becomes a challenge, because you have to understand, you have to figure out, okay, where are my bedding patterns in relationship, honestly, to food? When it gets bitter cold out, those deer are moving from bedding to food. And on a public area, like Dan said, you're going to have to go and cover a bunch of ground until you see some sort of sign or can locate a naturally occurring food source that they're on in that late season. Now, if you have access to private property, there's an adjacent cornfield, or you planted a food plot, well, then you're going to get deer coming to that food source, I can almost guarantee. It's going to happen.
Dave's property, if we don't have brassica plots in there, it's a ghost town.
Right.
There wouldn't be a track out there. And right now there are deer all over that property because there's brassicas.
And so take advantage. Don't understate the fact that you see a lot of deer tracks and a lot of heavy trails in an area during late season. If the tracks are there, and again, even if you don't see mature tracks in there, if you've got a lot of deer tracks, that mature animal might find his way into that area because those deer are herding up. I mean, I saw that pattern in one of the spots where I were hunting, where I bounced all over the place. I got into a few spots that I wanted to try, but there really wasn't any tracks. What happened during those sits? I didn't see any deer. Because, there was very limited movement in those areas. Now, it kept drawing me back to the spots that had heavy deer traffic and heavy trails. Now, I probably was seeing the same deer over and over and over again. The 5-pointer, this group of doe that I was seeing. But that's where the deer were congregating, because they wanted to be in that area because it was close to food. So having snow on the ground is a huge advantage. If you get a fresh snowfall and you still got a tag in late season and you can get out and scout, get out there on the day after that snowfall and just look, see where stuff went. Mark those patterns of where they were moving and walking. It's such a huge advantage, because normally you can't see.
Right.
All right, I don't know. Is there anything else about 2017?
Nope.
It was a good year. It was fun.
Yeah, I had a blast. I mean, in my younger days, I might have got angry or something, that you don't get a deer or something. But I'm to a point now where I enjoy it. I enjoy the hunt and I enjoy the chase, and it was just a good season all the way around. I think the last time I didn't shoot a buck big enough to be worthy of hanging on a wall was 2006, and the time before that was probably about 1986 or 87, somewhere in that range.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm used to killing deer every year, but I really enjoyed having a full season of hunting. I really enjoyed getting out in the late season, and I just think it was a good time. It was a blast all the way around.
That's interesting. When had land in my family and I'd hunt that on a pretty consistent basis. I think when you make the decision that you want to go after a more mature animal or you want to shoot a certain age class buck, that's a personal decision that you have to make. I had opportunities on smaller bucks. I chose to pass them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's human. Like, you set a goal on anything and you want to try to achieve that goal during your season. It's normal to feel a little bit frustrated or but I think you have to look at this stuff as, okay, the season's now done. There were times during the season when I told Dan, I just want to be done. I'm like, the next thing that comes by, if that 5-pointer comes by, I just want to shoot him and be done.
You had a lot more challenges than I had, because you had a family member die, and you had to be there for that person, and I mean, that really screwed up your hunt right in the middle of the prime time. And then even when you can get out there, you got your mind on hunting.
Right.
And that's tough. I mean, but hunting is like that. There's all kinds of things that go on, all kinds of things that happen. You talk about goals. I was just thinking about this the other day, how my goals fluctuated. I went into the season thinking, you know what, I should just hold out for something like 160 or better. And I kind of went in there thinking, maybe I should just let some good bucks, some of these good bucks that are going to come out right away, slide past me.
Yeah. And
no bucks were coming out sliding past me. No good ones.
Yeah.
They're all little rag racks. And then when we get into rut, my goals started shifting, and I started thinking, you know what, 125 and better, it's going down, and I'm going to Nebraska or North Dakota or whatever. There's too much of this stuff running around. I'm not seeing big stuff. And then all of a sudden that big buck shows up in that peninsula. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm going to let those go past. And now I'm letting deer go past me that I was shooting at 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And and then we don't get that deer. And I start thinking, going back to the whole, maybe I'll just shoot 125 and I get late season in Nebraska. And then all of a sudden, I ain't got really much of anything to hunt. And I'm kind of like, I get stuck in this bad area. I draw a unit in a conservancy that ain't really that great in my eyes. And I throw up a camera thinking, well, maybe there's something nice around. There's a scrape here, some rubs and stuff. And I check the camera, and there's an 8-pointer about like this, and 100 inches. I'm not shooting them. That's the only buck that's visiting that scrape. And I'm like, I'm done here. And what happens is I would have shot the first 125 that walked past at that point. And my brother comes to do some work for me, and he tells me about somebody in his family. He's up from the UP, and they ain't got a lot of money up there. And this person is struggling. He says, you got an extra doe tag, can you shoot him a doe? I says, you know what, I got that one stand, I got all this does coming by, no bucks, I'll go out there and I'll shoot him a doe. So I go out there, and that wasn't a cell cam, that was a regular cam. So I pull the card out, climb up the tree, and I pop it in my little card reader, and I open it up, and the first picture is a daylight picture of about a mid-160s class 9-pointer. I'm like, what the hell in daylight? I'm like, what the? Start clicking through, and there's this giant 10-pointer. I'm like, what the hell happened?
Yeah.
And needless to say, about 5-6 does came by me that night, and not one got shot. All of a sudden your goals change again. And you hear these people tell you goal things that you just think in your head, what are you, an idiot? Well, you talk out of your ass? You hear guys say, this is the only buck I'm hunting. I'm hunting one buck and that's it. Oh, okay, so if that 160-inch buck doesn't come by you, but a 185-inch buck does, you're not shooting it?
Right.
Or that buck gets hit by a car, you're done hunting for the season?
Yeah.
Goals change.
Yeah.
They can change daily, they can change weekly, but goals change. And to me, it ain't about bragging rights. I don't have to have every one of my bucks, I only shoot 150 or better. I might be happy if I went to Michigan and hunted some heavily pressured land with 1 million people on it and I shot a 100-inch buck. I might be happy with that. Or North Carolina or something, or whatever. But my goals change based on the property I'm hunting, based on the deer I'm after, based on what I'm seeing, based on what's around.
Yeah, I think, as Dan just mentioned, it has to be about what you want. A lot of us, because we're all part of an online forum and we share information. Sometimes we get caught up in the fact of, hey, if I don't get one or if I don't shoot a certain size buck, what are people going to think and this stuff? Ultimately, hunting's about the experience you want to get out of it, what you learn. Right. I think Joe R.E. just posted his season in review, and he talked about his favorite moment of his season was getting his buddy on this huge 9-pointer, and that after that moment, he kind of felt like his season was done because, and he ended up taking 2 more bucks. He got 2 bucks but he felt like that was the apex point of his season because it was this cool setup. His buddy got on the buck, and I think that's where you have to assess it. What do you do it for? Is it and you'll figure it out. I remember plenty of seasons in the past where I was like, buck would come out when I was coaching wrestling on a consistent basis, and I had a very small window of when I could hunt.
Mm-hmm.
Buck would come out, I'd look at him and say, yep, he's good enough. He's a taker, I want my venison, and these weren't giants, and boom, I'd take them. And I was perfectly happy. The hunt happened how it did, I set up how I wanted, everything, so it really is about where you want to go with your goals and where.
Do you remember how fun hunting was when you were like 18, 19 years old and you're just out there to get one and you got one, you're happy as hell, and the more you get into this trophy hunting, the more it gets a little frustrating, the more it gets a little hard, the more you see these stages with hunters. I mean, first you want to kill a deer, then you want to kill a buck, and then there's a stage of how long you want to kill bucks, and it gets boring. You start getting too good at it, so you start holding out for racked bucks, and then you get good at that, and pretty soon you're ending your season a couple weeks into it every year, and you start holding out for something a little bigger, and then there's that whole, it's got to be Pope and Young or better, and most people are putting those first few bucks in the book because they're proud and whatever, and then after a while that gets boring, and then you're holding out for something a little bigger, and every stage, some people get through, some people don't, and you see those stages where when people are trying to get that Pope and Young buck, and they think they're proving something to other people, but really you're just proving it to you, because I can tell you one thing, I really respect Joe R.E., Dewey, Stan, but next year, I ain't even going to remember if they got a buck or not this year. Nobody else is either. It's just in their heads that we care. And nobody cares if I get a buck. And I know that. Yeah. So that pressure is just me putting that pressure on me. And when you come to that realization, you no longer have that inner turmoil that a lot of the younger guys have when they're starting out as trophy hunters, where they got to get that buck. They got to make that kill. And when they blow it, it always hurts me to see those young guys so angry because they blew a shot. Mad, swearing, throwing things around, upset, I'm not going to hunt again for, and they sit back for a week or something, and then they get back around to it. Why are you mad? You had an opportunity. You were out there. You're in the game, man. You shouldn't be mad, but that's a stage we go through. I was there at one point, too. Everybody was. I'm sure you were.
Yeah.
Now I'm to a point where I'm just happy I saw a deer, and if I blow it, I'm kind of laughing about it, saying, I can't believe that thing got away. Kudos to you, you won. Kind of like a wrestling match when the big guy beats you, you get up and you shake his hand. That's what you're doing when you wave at that buck as he runs off.
Yeah. So that's an advice. I think that's good advice for someone that's taken this journey, and it's got to, find out what makes it important for yourself, and don't worry about what other people think or care about. If people care about what you're shooting or what you're doing, hunting is an experience. It's an adventure. It's a pastime. It's a way to get nice, clean, fresh meat. And, it is. It's like there's so many reasons more to involve yourself in hunting than just shooting a big racked animal. But
I remember a few years back, I shot about a 130-inch 8-pointer. And it was a good buck, but it wasn't a giant. And I was happy with it. And I brought it home. And I remember the biggest criticism I got was my wife walking out, looking at it and saying, I thought you were shooting big bucks.
Yeah, I think I remember that. I think that was the one that I helped you drag out. 'Cause I remember you telling me that.
It's like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. No one else. I mean, it's funny to say, but you yourself ultimately cares more about what you go out and what adventures and things that you do, you know, and I too, it's
One
so you
more
gotta put it
thing.
in perspective.
One more thing on that I just want to get across is the reason those people are struggling and angry and stuff is because they're worried about what people think. And if you want to help the situation, don't knock a guy for how big his buck is, for what he's done. Congratulate him, because that's his business.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's nothing that bothers me more than you see somebody online go, well, I wouldn't shoot it, but it's a good buck for you, or something like that. You're putting that guy in a situation where he feels like you're looking down on him. And
if you want to call it the industry or the media or how this has been shaped into this. The Beast is completely opposite from this. Although, you know, people share their stories about their bucks and big bucks, small bucks, and everything in between. But we do this. I had multiple people that are friends and just acquaintances that I know send me pictures of their bucks and say, this is one I took him this morning, you know. And at the end of the little story, they always said, yeah, I know, not a giant. Mm-hmm. And I wrote back to him every single time. Well, it looks like a darn good buck to me. Were you excited about the hunt? Did you have fun? Congratulations, etc., etc. Because I think the nature of what hunting has become a little puts pressure on people, or they feel that pressure that if they don't shoot, you know, what is this giant, or what they're seeing on the internet or on TV, that they're somehow not experiencing the same thing. And I don't think that's true.
It's not a competition.
Right.
You know, if it was, the guy with the most money wins.
Yeah.
It really is. Because the people who are shooting the giant bucks are buying them. Yeah. And if you think you're not buying them, even I'm buying them. I really am. It's just a matter of how much you're spending. Yeah. Because I'm spending way more than I'd be spending on meat. In my gasoline running around, certain equipment I got. You can't say I don't have an advantage if I'm using a certain type of stand over somebody else's clinky piece of crap. Everything that gives you an advantage, if you lease a piece of property, now you got an advantage over somebody public. If you own a piece of property, you know, and people want to look down at somebody for owning a square mile, you know, like say Andre, he's got that square mile land, and he leases everything around it, and you can walk out there any day and shoot a big buck. And that ain't reality to me and you,
right?
But it's still reality. It's a matter of what he's willing to put into it and what he wants to get out of it.
Right.
And every one of us, to some degree, buys our deer. Yeah. You know, and you can't really look down on somebody else because it's not apples to apples. I mean, we've got guys on the forum, one guy in a wheelchair, one guy that's got Lyme's disease, can hardly walk, and those guys struggle and drag themselves out in these swamps, and in some cases risk their life to get out into an area to hunt, and they shoot an 8-pointer or something. I don't ever want to see somebody look down on that. That is an incredible accomplishment for them to do that.
Right.
I'm very lucky and fortunate that I'm in the health I am, have the job I have, that I've got money coming in, that I can do the things that I do, and go out there and pursue these deer. And just because I want to do it on public land and compare myself to everybody else doesn't mean that's the way it's got to be. Number one, you just worry about you, every one of us. And you know, not only should you not put somebody down, you should never tolerate somebody else doing it. Set them straight. You see somebody put somebody down for a deer that they shot, or knocking them, knock them one.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Well, I think we've talked that topic enough.
Yeah, I kind of rattle on sometimes.
Yeah.
At least that's what Mario tells me.
So that really concludes Dan and myself, our 2017 season. I think we're excited for what 2018 has in store. Yeah.
I think there's a couple big ones that made it through this year. They're going to be around next year.
Definitely. There's always going to be a big deer out there. That's the one thing I realized. There's always going to be one out there that you're going to want to chase. So you just got to put it in perspective, have fun with it,
Yeah.
So, all right. Thanks for tuning in for the season in review. Again, if you got any questions or anything, just post them on the forum. Talk to you guys later.
That concludes today's podcast episode. Please go to thehuntingbeast.com to post any discussions, questions, or comments regarding today's podcast episode.